Good day. Today is Tuesday, 1st July 2025, and today the American and Iranian governments continue to communicate with each other largely through the media, though we are told that conversations are taking place in private, that Steve Witkoff and presumably Abbas Araghchi are in telephone contact. The Americans apparently trying to get negotiations between themselves and the Iranians resumed, and the Iranians saying no. Now that is my conclusion about what is happening. There's been an article in the London Times which talks about how the United States is trying to get negotiations between itself and Iran underway, but there's been fairly firm statements by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi clearly saying no. So the article in the London Times reads as follows: as Trump stonewalls Iran, his aides push frantically for a nuclear deal. The race is on to replace a pact secured by President Obama, but talks are waylaid by the question of Tehran's right to enrich uranium. Now, the interesting thing about that title, and clearly the article, which is by David Charter, who is based in Washington, gives every impression of being well sourced. The interesting thing about that article is, why is there a frantic rush? Frantic is the word the article uses, the title uses, to achieve a deal with Iran if, as President Trump says, Iran's nuclear enrichment program has been completely obliterated. The word frantic implies haste. Why is there a reason for haste? Well, let's perhaps not read too much into a title. Titles are chosen by editors. They're not chosen by the writers of the articles themselves. At least that's true of the national media, of the mainstream media, I should say. So perhaps it could be that this is the case of an editor on the London Times, the Murdoch media, by the way, because the London Times is part of the Murdoch media, wanting to give a dramatic flourish to the title. But anyway, the article then goes on to say President Trump is pursuing a nuclear deal with Iran behind the scenes, despite claiming he is not even talking to them, and attacking Ayatollah Ali Khamenei for his anger, hatred, and disgust towards Israel and the United States. Trump's peace envoy Steve Witkoff remains in contact through direct and indirect channels with Iranian officials, the White House confirmed, even as Tehran asserts its sovereign right to enrich uranium. And then we're told that the United States has already conducted a military strike against Iran, as we know, but that Trump has a carrot as well as a stick in the way of sanctions relief, which Witkoff can offer as a reward for Tehran signing up to a long-term deal to replace the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which Trump withdrew from in 2018. And then we're told that the administration is attempting to increase the isolation of Iran by signing up more Arab states to the Abraham Accords. Well, possibly, but for the moment, there's no sign of any movement in that direction on the part of any of the Arab states. And when they say Arab states, presumably the ones they mean principally are Saudi Arabia and Syria. There's a lot of talk about Syria signing the Abraham Accords, but why would the Iranian government be impressed by the fact that al-Jilani is going against his own often stated principles by signing a deal like that with Israel? just asking. And as I said, MBS for the moment seems to be rejecting the idea. And anyway, to continue, Trump hopes to keep pressure on Iran to follow through and sign a written agreement to abandon or, and then the most interesting word, limit enrichment by concluding a new ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the coming days. Why would a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, in other words, a ceasefire in Gaza, why would that increase pressure on Iran to abandon or limit enrichment? And for clarity, Iran has never said that it would not be open to limiting enrichment, and that's the word that appears in the London Times article. It always said that what it will not do is abandon enrichment. Under the JCPOA, the original deal that was concluded in 2015, Iran agreed to limit uranium enrichment to 3.7%. Apparently, over the course of the discussions that were taking place before Netanyahu and Trump launched their 12-day war against Iran, Iran had already signaled that it was prepared to return to that and had indicated that it would be willing to go back to 3.7% enrichment. That there were still many other aspects of any proposed deal to work out. Of course, what then happened is that Trump, following taking up the cue from Netanyahu, suddenly announced that he wasn't prepared to accept limited enrichment by Iran. He was insisting on Iran abandoning enrichment entirely. Zero enrichment, even though that is something that Iran is entitled to do, to enrich uranium under the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and which all other signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty have a sovereign right under the treaty to do. Anyway, it's all very interesting. Could it be that there is now an attempt being made to move forward with some kind of a deal with Iran that does allow it limited enrichment after all, that the talk about new Abraham Accords with Syria and sanctions relief to Syria, which, by the way, the United States has just granted. Trump has just signed an executive order lifting sanctions on Syria, are in effect on al-Jalani's regime, though that's probably not going to improve the situation in Syria at all. The reports I'm getting is that it's getting worse and worse in Syria every day, but anyway, never mind. Could it be that and the talk about Abraham Accord deals with perhaps Saudi Arabia is an attempt by the United States to persuade Iran that just as the United States is prepared to do deals with Syria and ultimately Saudi Arabia, it's prepared to do favorable sweetheart deals with Iran, lifting sanctions and all of that, if it agrees to do what before the attack it had previously already said that it would do, which is agree to limits on its enrichment program. And then perhaps reinforcing that, there is a comment from Jonathan Panikoff, director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Anything connected to the Atlantic Council is hardly going to be a moderate body. The Atlantic Council is deeply neocon in its character, just to say. Anyway, Jonathan Panikov, who was also former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East at the National Intelligence Council. Anyway, Jonathan Panikov says this is according to the article in the London Times, at the end of the day, President Trump is always eager to have a deal. The challenge is going to be, it is hard to imagine the US moving off of its no enrichment line. So that means Iran would have to make a decision that it's going to have to change a long-held policy, that it must be able to have a right to self-enrich. And it may be possible to return to the idea of an international consortium overseeing the Iranian civil nuclear program, either inside or out of the country itself, which is in fact a proposal the Iranians made, an international consortium which would permit enrichment to take place in Iran. But it goes on to say, Jennifer Panikov goes on to say that without Iranian agreement, there has to be an expectation that Israel is going to strike again. Well, it's all very strange and very confusing. It looks like an attempt to return to proposals that were there on the table before the 12-day war was launched, and the word frantic in the title perhaps suggests that deep down within the administration there is a dawning realization that the 12-day war was a disastrous mistake, that it has not actually prevented Iran from enriching uranium or pressing forward towards acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, if that is indeed what it chooses to do, that without the IAEA present in Iran, and the Iranians have shown the door to the IAEA, the United States has now lost all track of what Iran is doing with its enriched uranium stockpile, and that in fact the way is more open now than it was before the 12-day war for Iran to develop and acquire the capability to have, if it chooses, a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon. So maybe this is why there is this frantic urgency about getting the negotiations going again, about trying to find some mechanism to restart the negotiations and return to the deals that were there in principle or being worked out in principle before the 12-day war started. Now, the Iranians have responded to all of this, and the person who's provided the response is none other than the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi. And he's done so in an interview to CBS News, which was aired today, and which has also, by the way, been heavily covered in the Russian media. It is the lead story as I make this program on the website of Russia's official TASS news agency. I'm going to take the account of this interview from the Iranian media, and this is the account that the Iranian media is providing. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has asserted that Iran's nuclear energy know-how and determination to further advance its peaceful nuclear industry cannot simply be destroyed through military aggression. One cannot obliterate the technology and science for peaceful uranium enrichment through bombing. And he then goes on to say that as far as Iran is concerned, Iran can recover, can repair all of the damage done if there is the damage done to the Iranian nuclear sites by the American bombing, if there is will on our side, and the will exists in order to once again make progress in this industry, we will be able expeditiously to repair the damage and make up for lost time. And Arakshi then goes on to say that according to him, the nation's pride, Iran's pride in the industry, has been powerfully demonstrated during its decisive defense of the country, including its nuclear installations throughout the Israeli-imposed war. We have also gone through 12 days of imposed war. Therefore, people will not easily back down from enrichment. During the war, we demonstrated and proved our ability to defend ourselves. Talks will not restart so quickly. I don't think negotiations will restart as quickly as those in the US hope. And then he goes on to say, and this is the key, in order for us to decide to re-engage, we will have first to ensure that the United States will not revert back to targeting us in a military attack during the diplomatic process. I think with all of these considerations, we still need more time. And he went on to say that the United States insisting that Iran give up entirely nuclear enrichment, as far as Iran is concerned, is not an option. So anyway, there we have it. The Iranians are saying that they're not even prepared to discuss a resumption of the negotiations unless the United States guarantees that it is not going to attack again whilst the negotiations are underway. What happened, of course, in June was that the United States and Israel did attack Iran whilst the negotiations were underway. In fact, the Israelis launched attacks on Thursday the 12th of June and Friday the 13th of June, shortly before talks between Iran and the United States were supposed to resume in Oman on the 15th of June, and the Iranians, as I discussed in my program yesterday, are saying that the attack that was launched against them on the 12th and 13th of June aimed to eliminate the entire political and military leadership of Iran, including the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, and also sought to panic Iranian officials to quit Iran, or at least Tehran, through aggressive telephone messages. Aggressive is an understatement, made by Israeli intelligence officers, threatening them and their families unless they left. So what Arakshi is saying is that we will never submit to that again. We will never put ourselves in that position again. We want guarantees that in future there will be no similar attacks upon us like the one that took place in June, and that has to be a guarantee provided by the United States and, by extension, Israel also, because the one thing that the 12-day war demonstrated conclusively is that without the direct involvement of the United States, Israel cannot defeat Iran. Now, will the United States give such a guarantee? What sort of guarantee can the United States give that Iran can accept? If Donald Trump simply comes out and makes a statement that the United States and Israel are not going to attack Iran whilst there are negotiations underway between the United States and Iran, can Iran accept such a statement, given that Donald Trump has repeatedly said different and contradictory things over the last 2 weeks, and of course himself made threats against the supreme leader of Iran, floated possibilities of regime change, and ultimately green-lighted an attack on Iran upon Iran's nuclear facilities. Can the Iranians then accept a statement coming from him? Can they accept a statement coming from him, given that the events of the last 2-3 weeks suggest that the United States has either limited ability to control what the Israelis do, or perhaps no ability at all, or on the contrary, has engaged in deceptions of Iran in collusion with Israel, seeking to lull Iran and to attack it by surprise. I would have thought that the Iranians cannot accept any mere statements from President Trump, certainly no verbal statements. I am not sure what form of guarantee the United States can give to Iran that the Iranians would accept, and at the very least, obviously, it would have to be in writing. But I am going to guess that at the very least, the Iranians will want not just a written guarantee from the United States, but one which is also backed by third parties, perhaps by the United States' allies, its European allies. I cannot imagine Israel, under any government, by the way, giving a guarantee like that. But also perhaps third parties, other third parties, Iran's allies and friends, China and Russia. There is an important point to make about all of this. The spin that continues to be spread across the media in the West was that the attack on Iran, Israel and America's attack on Iran, was overall a success, even if it didn't actually completely destroy Iran's nuclear enrichment program. I take the diametrically opposite view, as do many people on independent media. You do actually find a number of statements also on what you might call mainstream media, which also take a different view. There was an article by Daniel De Petris in the Daily Telegraph, which also said that the attack on Iran was ultimately a complete disaster, just saying. And there is also an article in Foreign Policy by Jeffrey Lewis. Iran is on course for a bomb after US strikes failed to destroy facilities. And that article appeared on the 27th of June. So there are some people in the mainstream media who are, I think, starting to get a clearer picture of the disastrous mistake that this attack on Iran has turned out to be. To reiterate, what happened over the course of the war is that Israel found that it could not deal a knockout blow against Iran. Its attempt in the first few hours of the attack to decapitate the whole of Iran's leadership failed. As the war dragged on, the balance started to shift increasingly in Iran's favor. It became increasingly clear that Iranian missiles were able to hit targets in Israel, that more and more targets were being hit, that this was causing having a devastating effect on Israel's economy, closing its ports and its one international airport, that it was starting to inflict severe damage on parts of Israel's military infrastructure, and that Israel was unable to deal effectively with Iran's nuclear facilities and was rapidly running through its stockpile of air defense missiles and was falling disastrously short of those. There are reports which suggest, and they're almost certainly true, that as Israel's situation deteriorated, it began to call urgently upon the United States to try to get the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire, and that the American strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities on Fordow, Isfahan, and Natanz, though doubtless in Donald Trump's mind also intended to knock out those facilities. When he says that they were obliterated, I'm sure that part of him believes that, and that was his intention. But it was also intended to try to provide cover for the ceasefire that Donald Trump, by this point, was urgently seeking, both on Israel's behalf and on his own behalf, and that of the United States. I've already discussed the increasingly panic-stricken posts that Donald Trump was posting on his Truth Social account, even as steps started to crystallize towards a ceasefire on the day that the ceasefire was finally announced. So the balance of advantage in the conflict ended up in Iran's favor. And as I said in many programs, as de Petris and Jeffrey Archer have also pointed out in Foreign Policy, ultimately what has now happened is that Iran is in a position to move forward with its enrichment program and can do so without having all of the information about it conveyed to the United States and to Israel by the International Atomic Energy Agency, to which it has shown the door. So this explains why the Americans are becoming frantic, why they're desperate to get the negotiations restarted, why Witkoff is telephoning Arakci, and why Arakci, for his part, is now demanding guarantees. I'm not sure how this moves forward. Maybe some kind of negotiation will resume in a few weeks or months' time. But if and when it does, it's likely that the Iranians will feel that they're in a stronger position than the one in which they were in before the attack took place. And quite plausibly, they will push a harder bargain than the one they did before. Just saying. Now, that brings me back to Iran's own position, and I've discussed in many programs now why I think it would make better sense for Iran to conclude security agreements with Russia and China rather than to seek a nuclear weapons capability. And I've been reading more information about the latter, and that has in general reinforced my view. The general opinion seems to be that if Iran has retained the entirety of its enriched uranium stockpile, the part of its stockpile which has been enriched to 60% levels, 400 kilos worth, that in about 3 years it might have developed out of that stockpile around 12 nuclear bombs. 12 nuclear bombs. Now, as has been pointed out, that would provide Iran with a devastating first strike capability against Israel. Israel is a small country. If it was struck by Iran with 12 nuclear bombs, I mean, the effects on Israel would be unimaginable, and I'm not going to discuss them because I don't find it easy to talk about those things. But Iran would not have a reserve or second strike capability. It would then be exposed to a vastly more powerful strike upon itself, which would also have horrendous effects, unimaginable effects on Iran. And of course, in the time that it took Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, the risks that the Israelis and the Americans would want to preempt that would increase enormously. In order for Iran to be able to acquire not just a first strike, but a second strike or reserve capability, to find itself in the kind of situation that North Korea is in today, you are looking at a nuclear weapons program that would take perhaps a decade. Now, I think that would not only be disastrously destabilizing for the situation in the Middle East, and not only would it undermine the entire nuclear non-proliferation system with disastrous consequences for global security, but I think it would create enormous risks for Iran as well. And I think that it's probably not something that Iran should ever even contemplate doing. But then, to repeat once more, if Iran sticks to its present position, retains its nuclear stockpile, does not move forward with acquiring a nuclear weapon, continues to enrich uranium to 60% levels, but does not make any kind of agreements with the United States, and continues on its present course of relying on its own resources to guarantee its own security, then, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it seems to me that it's setting itself up again for a future attack by Israel and the United States, and as night follows day, that attack is now bound to come. So we go back to what I was talking about in my various programs, which is that Iran's best course, it seems to me, is to accept that complete self-reliance for a country like Iran in the present security situation in which Iran finds itself is a utopian idea that Iran needs to forge closer, stronger links with its allies and accept the offers of assistance that those allies, Russia and China, and perhaps other countries like Pakistan and conceivably North Korea, are offering. Now, I've been going through some of the various treaties and provisions and agreements that Iran has concluded over the last few years. Firstly, there was the 25-year agreement between China and Iran that does not appear to set out any security provisions. So there's nothing similar to that there. But it is in many respects an agreement that seems to chime very closely with the recent partnership agreement that was concluded by Iran and Russia. Now, that agreement has a tangled history. The partnership agreement between Russia and Iran, as we know, because the Russians have told us, they did originally propose a defense agreement with Iran to be incorporated in this partnership agreement, but Iran rejected it. Then the agreement was signed by Pezeshkian and Putin in January. The Russian parliament ratified the agreement in February. The Iranian parliament, the Majlis, passed a vote agreeing to the ratification of the partnership agreement on the 21st of May. But Iran's Guardianship Council, which in effect functions as a third section, a reviewing section of the Iranian parliament, it must be in a kind of a way counted as a body of the Iranian parliament, because it reviews and either confirms or rejects all legislation that the Iranian parliament enacts. Anyway, the Guardianship Council only finally completed Iran's process of ratification of the partnership treaty with Russia on the 11th of June. That is the day before Israel began its attack on Iran. So the Iranians cannot have been said to have sped forward with ratification of this agreement. I'm not sure that it much matters, but there it is. Now, there's been some claims that the Russians have at various times offered Iran Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, but that they've dragged their feet in supplying Sukhoi 25 fighter jets and Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, that an agreement was reached for the Sukhoi 35s to be supplied to Iran in 2023, and that they haven't yet been delivered. I would add that if it really were the case that an agreement had been made in 2023 by Russia and Iran for Russia to supply Sukhoi 35 fighter jets to Iran, then 2 years is not by any means a long time frame for delivery of advanced fighter jets. In fact, it is not just standard. If the fighter jets were delivered this year, it would be, in fact, a relatively fast delivery. Unfortunately, it seems that it isn't, again, quite as straightforward as this. Apparently, talk about Iran and Russia having agreed on a supply by Russia of Sukhoi 35 jets. Reports to that effect started to appear in the Russian media in late 2022. Then they were confirmed, or appeared to be confirmed, in the spring of 2023 by the Tasnim news agency, which is an Iranian news agency. Then in August 2023, the Iranian defense minister started to make comments suggesting that, in fact, no agreement had been reached, that the Iranians were still considering the proposal. Then there were further commentaries and discussions, both in the Russian and Iranian media, about the supply of Sukhoi 35s, which continued through 2023 and 2024. The Russians several times reporting that a deal had been done, the Iranians appearing to confirm that a deal had been done, and then appearing to have second thoughts about it. And then only in January of this year, in January 2025, at around the time when the partnership agreement was finally agreed, did we have what looked like more concrete or definite statements from Iranian officials that a deal had indeed been done for Russia to supply Sukhoi 35 fighter jets to Iran. Obviously, the whole story isn't there, but from what I can reconstruct, it appears to me as if the party that was dragging its feet on this question was not Russia, but Iran. That again, there was resistance on the part of some people in Iran, people within the military leadership, some of the stronger political figures, to the idea of buying fighter jets from the Russians. That just as Iran took its time to first agree and then ratify the partnership treaty with Russia, it was Iran which ultimately hesitated about finalizing this deal to buy Sukhoi 35 jets from Russia as well. And one could see this also the way it's played out with deliveries of an entirely different aircraft by Russia to Iran. In order to train pilots to fly Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, there is a complex course of training, and one of the training aircraft that the Russians use for that is the Yak-130 training aircraft, which also has an effective ground attack capability. Anyway, there were reports in 2023 that the Russians were going to deliver Yak-130 trainer aircraft to Iran. Then reports appeared that two of these trainers, these Yak-130 trainers, had indeed been delivered to Iran. That seemed to be preparatory for training fighter pilots to fly the Sukhoi 35 fighters that were supposed to come. But then the deliveries of the Yak-130 stopped, and the total number of these very advanced trainers delivered to Iran stopped at 2. Again, from what I can see, the hesitation came from Iran. Now, to repeat again, I can understand why the Iranians, who have very much a policy of self-reliance here, and in terms of their own security, and made that sovereign decision long ago, are hesitating to rely on a country like Russia, with which they have had very uneasy terms in the past for vital military technologies. There are reports that they're now thinking about turning to China for those military technologies instead. And in my opinion, they should. They should actually seek those military technologies from China as well. But to repeat again, given that Iran has just been attacked by Israel and the United States, and that further attacks upon Iran from Israel and the United States are almost certainly coming, especially given the deadlock in the negotiating process that we are looking at, I simply don't think that Iran has the luxury to defer these important procurement decisions for much longer. Now, I don't know how long it would take for the Russians to supply Sukhoi 35s. There are various people who claim that because the Russians are committed to fighting the conflict in Ukraine, they don't have any Sukhoi 35s or S-400s to spare. But Russia has just agreed expedited deliveries of more Sukhoi S-400 missiles to India to replace missiles that India used in its short war with Pakistan, its recent air battle with Pakistan. Russia is apparently prepared to supply India with more units, batteries of S-400s to make up for the S-400s, to supplement the S-400s that India already has. And Russia seems to be able to produce Sukhoi 35s now on a fairly regular basis. They've just delivered a further batch to the Russian Air Force just a few days ago. So I would have thought that the Russians can supply Iran with Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. It's something that the Iranians need to find out and work out for themselves, but they need to move forward expeditiously with these matters. And if they want the Chinese to provide them with JC-10s, well, I think they should. They should diversify their arms imports. That is something that countries that want to remain independent definitely need to do. It's probably a good idea not to rely on one supplier, including a supplier like Russia, with which you had an edgy relationship in the past. But again, a decision needs to be made quickly, because it is likely that it will take some time for JC-10s to be provided to Iran. And besides, the Iranians need to learn how to fly these aircraft and to integrate them in their air defense systems. And one way or the other, to repeat again, the Iranians do need to finally make a decision, or so it seems to me, about integrating Russian and Chinese technology in their air defense system, and should start seeking assistance from their allies to develop an integrated air defense system of the sort that they clearly don't have. Anyway, I have labored these points at length. Obviously, Iran is the country that will make the final decisions on these matters. But just to say again, there is no indefinite time here. The Americans are looking for, apparently, they want to restart the negotiations. The Iranians are asking the Americans for guarantees that they will not be attacked if the negotiations resume. The best guarantee that Iran has against such an attack is a strong air defense system, one powerful enough to deter the United States and Israel still more. Iran doesn't have such a system at the moment. It needs to set up such a system at speed. The Russians and the Chinese can help here. They've indicated they are prepared to help. I think that the Iranians need to put aside their hesitation and accept the help that is being offered to them by their friends. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I hope and expect, well, I don't hope, but I expect that this will be my last program on this topic, my last, or at least the last time I will return to this topic for some time. I suspect I've said this already, but I think it would be very dangerous indeed for Iran to accept any guarantees, even if they are provided in writing by the United States. The best guarantee that Iran has against future attacks is the strength of its own armed forces. They are very effective, as events have shown. In some regards, they can launch missiles against Israel, but nobody who followed the events of the 12-day war can deny that in critical areas, Iran's air defense fell short. Anyway, that's what I think. That's what I believe. Obviously, others, if they wish, can push back and set up their own views. Now, even as this conflict between Iran and the United States and Iran and Israel has reached its pause point, not only does the conflict between Ukraine and Russia continue, but we're getting more and more signs of frustration and exasperation on the part of the West as the Russian offensive continues to gain momentum. Now, I make that last point. I discussed yesterday how there has clearly been an organized attempt to try to claim in the media over the last few days that, in contrast to the obvious realities on the ground, the fact that the Russians are gaining ground all the time, and we will come to that later in the program, that the Russian offensive has either stalled or is running out of steam, or that Russia is only making gains at disproportionate cost. This has become an article of faith for many people in the West, and it is being very heavily promoted again at the moment. And one gets a sense of bafflement and frustration. One gets the sense that a sense of bafflement and frustration is beginning to take hold. There was a very interesting or curious article by Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph. Now, Owen Matthews writes for The Spectator and for the Daily Telegraph. He is, by the way, and I just should make this clear, in spite of some of the things that appear in his article, both an intelligent man and a well-informed man. He is somebody who, on occasions, has shown strong flashes of realism in his understanding of the war. But he has now written an article in the Daily Telegraph which reads, "Putin will fight to the bitter end." That's just the title. "Putin will fight to the bitter end and may bring the whole of Russia down with him." There is nothing in the article, by the way, that confirms the last point. That clearly, I would say, comes from the editor. And then you go on to read that the ruthless leader is ignoring all voices of pragmatism and reason, and that, I suspect, does reflect, to some extent, Owen Matthews' own view. And then you read that Moscow's summer offensive, slowly steamrolling towards the provincial capital of Sumy in the north and forwards along the line of control in Donbass, is yielding just a few square kilometers of advance at the cost of up to 1,000 daily casualties. What then can Putin possibly hope to achieve by choosing war over peace? And then we're told that Putin lives in an information bubble. He believes that he is winning the war, even though in fact and in reality, he is only making very, very gradual progress, though he does accept that the Russians are nonetheless making progress. He says that optimists are declaring Russia's summer offensive over. Realists fear that it is only getting started. Realists are correct. In western Donetsk last week, Russian forces seized a valuable lithium mine near the village of Shevchenko, a blow to Kiev's long-term development dreams of Western investment in its post-war reconstruction. Russia's next major push may be in Donbass, forcing Ukraine to redeploy its scarce manpower in a nightmarish game of whack-a-mole along a 1,200-kilometre long front line. But then he goes on to say this. One mystery is how Putin's war machine continues to function when Russia's forces are so brutally depleted and so appallingly led. And then we're told that even patriotic Russian military bloggers post daily horror stories of commanders sending troops into bloody meat assaults and extracting bribes from men to avoid being sent to their deaths. I haven't seen, there are no links provided for the last, and I haven't seen any Telegram channel, Russian Telegram channel, that I consider reliable that makes claims of that kind. There are lots of Telegram channels out there. Some of them, in my opinion, are run by Ukrainian military intelligence, just to say. And I wouldn't myself place great deal of reliance upon them. But anyway, Owen Jones is baffled, finds it mysterious that despite the Russians suffering all of these losses, despite the supposed incompetence and mismanagement of the Russian army, that it is able to continue to advance. He's baffled about this, but he repeats, he accepts that while despair, desertion and drug abuse may be rife on the front lines, and again to repeat, he provides no links or quotes to reference this, he says on the home front, Russia's morale remains high. And then he goes on to say if attrition is the gain, then it's Russia's massively larger economy and manpower that have the advantage. Putin, ignoring all voices of pragmatism and reason, seems determined to fight on till the bitter end, regardless of the price in blood and treasure. Well, you can sense here the frustration, the bitterness, the bafflement, and it's widely shared. If Russia is suffering all these enormous losses that the British Defence Ministry and the Ukrainians say that it is, if the Russian army is as badly led as they also say that it is, how is it that Russia is not only still fighting, but is still advancing and is putting Ukraine in this impossible position? Is it really the case of a bloody-minded, ruthless, out-of-touch leader, Vladimir Putin, forcing the Russian soldiers to keep on advancing in the face of staggering losses? Is that really the case? How is it in that case that, as Owen Matthews concedes, morale on the home front remains high? Well, there is, of course, a simple answer to all of this, but one which you will never find anybody in the West acknowledge. And that is that, in fact, Russian losses are nowhere near as high as people in the West assume. That this is not the bloody, chaotic, disastrous war that many are talking about for the Russians, that in fact, from a Russian point of view, the cost of the war, though doubtless high, continues to be affordable, and that is why the Russians are able to continue to keep advancing. Now, that seems to me obvious, and if you understand that, then to repeat again, everything else becomes clear, and much of the mystery that Owen Matthews is talking about suddenly dissipates, and we begin to understand that the war is not as costly or as difficult for the Russians as some people in the West imagine. And in fact, we have articles elsewhere appearing that give additional force to this. I read a report, for example, and again, I can't remember where, I think it was in the German media, which said that the Russians are currently producing around 1,200 tanks a year, 12 to 1,500 tanks a year. 300 of these are new T-90Ms. The remainder are heavily refurbished older tanks T-72s, and increasingly one suspects T-80s. But most of these tanks are not being sent to the front lines. The Russians are building up a big tank reserve in the rear. For example, they have already added 500 new or refurbished tanks to their reserve armies since the start of the year. And I've already discussed in previous programs how the Russians have two big reserve armies, which they have not yet deployed to the battle in Western Russia, and how these are only two amongst several other big reserve armies that the Russians are building up. Now, for this to be possible, it's very difficult to believe that the claims of Russian losses that are so often made are true. Now, the US Congressman Thomas Massie recently said that the briefings that Congress receives from the US intelligence community are often little more than propaganda. He attended a briefing, apparently recently, in which the US intelligence community informed the congressmen about Russian losses on the Ukrainian battlefields. He then asked what are the level of Ukrainian losses, and the intelligence officers who attended the meeting said they didn't know. And that, as Massie correctly says, puts the whole briefing into an odd perspective. Obviously, if you're going to calculate who is winning or who is losing a war, you need to have an understanding both of the losses of your own side as well as of the other side. But are all of these reports of 1 million Russian casualties, which I have seen, are they really true? What does 1 million casualties even mean? It clearly doesn't mean dead. Mediazona says, puts the number of Russian soldiers who have been killed at something like, I think it was 110 or 20,000 since the start of the conflict. I've already said that I'm starting to lose confidence in Mediazona as I come to learn more about both who set it up and who funded it. But anyway, clearly 1 million casualties doesn't mean dead. Does it mean irreplaceable losses? Does it mean people who have been lightly wounded? I remember that back in, I think it was the end of 2022, the then Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, said that around 95% of all Russian soldiers who had been wounded in the special military operation achieved complete recoveries and were able to rejoin their units. So, could it be that the number of irreplaceable losses, assuming that 1 million casualties figure is true, is only a fraction of that number? Or could it be that the whole number, the whole figure of 1 million is wrong and again derives from Ukrainian information that cannot be trusted? Now, there was a very interesting article which appeared 2 days ago on TASS, the official Russian news agency, which derived from a source within the Russian intelligence agencies. It was clearly an intelligence source. And this was about the situation in Sumy region. And the article addressed reports that have appeared in the Ukrainian media, and in particular in the American media, I think it was the Washington Post, that there were 50,000 Russian troops in Sumy region, that the Ukrainians were outnumbered 3-1 in Sumy region, and that there were no fortifications in Sumy region that the Ukrainians could rely upon. Now, the Russian source who spoke to TASS said that the article was clearly planted by Ukrainian military intelligence, by Kirill Budanov's organization. The source who spoke to TASS said that there were nowhere near as many as 50,000 Russian troops in Sumy region. He said the true number was significantly less. He said that, in fact, the Ukrainians had abundant fortifications in Sumy region, and that far from the Ukrainians being outnumbered 3-1 in Sumy region, the Ukrainians had actually redeployed substantial forces to Sumy region over the last couple of days, and that, in fact, the balance between Russian and Ukrainian forces there was almost even. The Russians do have critical advantages in Sumy region. They have far more artillery. Their air force is very active and is able to use fan bombs, which the Ukrainians cannot do. And the Russians also have gradually gained an ascendancy in drone warfare. But the balance of forces, numerically speaking, is nowhere near as uneven as that article implied. And the source who provided all this information to TASS said that this was clearly being done, that this article had clearly been planted in the American media by Budanov's organization, since some of the troops who were holding back the Russians, the Ukrainian troops who were holding back the Russians in Sumy region, were in fact special forces under Budanov's control, and that what Budanov was doing was that he was essentially trying to pass on blame for any failure by his forces. Firstly, onto the civilian administration in Sumy region, by implying that they had not built fortifications when in fact they had, and on Syrskyi, the Ukrainian overall military commander, for not deploying sufficient forces to Sumy region, when in fact he had done that also. So that was what this Russian source said. Maybe this Russian source had ulterior motives. Maybe things are different from what he's saying. But I think one should take all of that into account, and one needs to be extremely careful about all of these reports, because I'm going to say straightforwardly that I'm gradually coming round to the view that nearly all of the information that we're getting about Russian casualties, including much of the information that is coming via agencies like Media Zona, has Ukrainian origins. It originates from Ukraine. That it's the Ukrainians who are doing all of the research, trying to provide all the information about death notices and burials in Russian cemeteries, who are providing the information to the British and to the American defense ministries, and who are planting stories in the news media, and who are giving us this sense of colossal Russian losses. Now, one of the reasons why I think this may be true, and why I'm very careful and very cynical about these claims about enormous Russian losses, is because I have been here before. I think I mentioned this in the past. I remember during the 1980s, during the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, regularly reading claims about the level of Soviet losses in Afghanistan. At one point, I remember that claims were being made in the mainstream that Russian soldiers killed in Afghanistan numbered well in excess of 100,000. I seem to remember that shortly before the Soviet withdrawal, the figure had risen to something like 150,000. I clearly remember reading some commentaries in some parts of the British media that claimed that the Russians had lost 200,000 men killed in Afghanistan. When the actual numbers were published by the Soviet Defense Ministry, and these numbers were subsequently broadly confirmed by later research, it turned out that it was between, as I remember, 13 and 20,000, depending on how you exactly count the numbers, with many of these casualties being men who did not die in action, but died through poor health provision and those kind of things. So we can see that in the past, figures for casualties were massively inflated. And I have to say, I suspect that this is true now. And when people like Owen Matthews talk about the mystery, it is mysterious how the Russian military keeps on functioning. One mystery is how Putin's war machine continues to function. The answer is that it is not brutally depleted and appallingly led in the way that Owen Matthews believes at all. I'm going to say something else. It is a long time now that I have stopped reporting Russian claims about Ukrainian casualties, because though I believe these figures are probably closer to the truth, given that I completely don't believe any numbers now given for Russian casualties, I think it would be inappropriate for me to make assumptions about Ukrainian casualties, given the figures that given that all of the figures that we have for those are Russian provided. That the Ukrainians have massive personnel losses is, however, indisputable, because it is the Ukrainians themselves who are telling us so. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Now, it's not just Owen Matthews who's getting frustrated and exasperated. Someone else who's also becoming frustrated and exasperated is none other than Keith Kellogg. And he has now resurfaced. This is General Kellogg. And he's complaining bitterly about certain comments that he attributes to Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov. And Kellogg has posted this comment on X. He says Peskov's recent comments on the state of negotiations are Orwellian. Russian claims that it is the US and Ukraine stalling peace talks are unfounded. President Trump has been consistent and adamant about making progress to end the war. We urge an immediate ceasefire and a move to trilateral talks to end the war. Russia cannot continue to stall for time while it bombs civilian targets in Ukraine. Now, I found that message absolutely baffling, because I have nowhere seen any comment of Peskov in which he accuses the United States, as well as Ukraine, of stalling peace talks. Just to say, I'm not aware of any such comment of Peskov's. And sure enough, when you look to find where Kellogg is getting his information, well, the link he provides is to the Kiev Independent. Again, going to the Ukrainian media for information about what Peskov is saying. Now, this is extremely concerning. Kellogg is supposed to be a US official engaged in some kind of mediation exercise between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I and many other people have pointed out how bizarre that is, given that the United States has been arming and assisting Ukraine. Bizarre that the United States should consider itself to be a mediator. But here you can see that General Kellogg is getting his information about what President Putin's spokesman is saying, President Putin of Russia's spokesman is saying, not from the Russian media, where you should logically go for that information, but from the Ukrainian. And in fact, if you go to the Ukrainian article that Kellogg is drawing his information from in the Kiev Independent, which reads, after months of stalling, Russia blames Ukraine, US for slow pace of peace talks. You will not find anywhere any reference to anything that Peskov actually said that shows the Russians blaming Ukraine or the US, specifically not the US, for the slow pace of peace talks. The closest that I could find to this is a comment made yesterday by Peskov, quoted by TASS, in which Peskov was asked about drone attacks, Russian drone attacks, the massive drone and missile attacks on Ukraine. And Peskov responded, a special military operation is still underway. The Kiev authorities know perfectly well what needs to be done to stop the fighting within the framework of the special military operation. All of our conditions were announced by President Putin a year ago in a speech delivered to the leadership of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Kiev is well aware of the statements made by President Putin. In other words, Peskov simply pointed out that for the moment, the special military operation is still underway because there's been no agreement, and that the Russians have set out their terms, and so far the Ukrainians have not agreed to them. There's no word there of Putin blaming the Ukrainians or accusing the Americans of stalling peace talks. What he's saying is the special military operation continues until and unless the Ukrainians accept the Russian terms. A very, very different sort of comment. But here again, you see Kellogg, he gets his sense of what the Russian position is from what the Ukrainians say. So the Ukrainians say that Peskov blamed the United States for stalling the talks, and Kellogg assumes that that is true. The Ukrainians say that the Russians have suffered 1 million casualties, and the British and American defense ministries assume that that is true. This is not going to help understand the war or explain where the war is actually going. And here I'm going to say a little bit about the state of the war now, because in fact, not only are Russian advances continuing and indeed accelerating, but we've had a lot of fairly dramatic news over the last 24 hours. Firstly, in the Siversk area, it does appear as if the Russians have now broken into the village of Serebyanka near to Siversk, and there is talk that that village is indeed likely to fall fairly soon. The Russians have also apparently started to advance towards the village of Veliko Mikhailovka in the western Donbass area, and simultaneously they're attacking the town of Novopavlovka a little further north in Dnipropetrovsk region, having recently captured the village of Dachnie in this specific area. The Russians have also captured the village of Malinivka in Zaporozhye region, and they seem to be pushing towards another village called, or small town rather, called Uspenivka, apparently with the purpose of cutting off the communications to Gulyapolye, town in Zaporozhye region, and ultimately to Orekhov as well. Now, all of these places, but especially perhaps most importantly, Veliko Mikhailovka, are within the map that I have been working from in understanding the battle in Zaporozhye region. As I said, all of these various Russian forces, the Russian force that has broken through in Kamyanska, immediately to the south of the city of Zaporozhye, the force that is advancing towards Uspenivka, and which looks like it's preparing to advance on Gulyapolye, and the force that is now approaching Veliko Mikhailovka. All of these places are within the map that I work from, which centers on the city of Zaporozhye itself. It seems to me that we are in the early stages of a breakthrough, and my guess is that by late summer, early autumn, we're going to see the Russians starting the battle for Zaporozhye city itself. I think that we are heading increasingly there, that we're starting to see several Russian groups of forces now beginning to converge on Zaporozhye city, and well, that's going to be a titanic battle, no doubt, when it comes, but it is already starting to, the various parts of it are starting to come together. To repeat again, a point I've made many times, if the Russians reach the Dnieper in this area, where Zaporozhye and the city of Dnipro are located, then it is an existential crisis for Ukraine. The Russians will be in the heartland area of Ukraine itself. It's very, very difficult to see how Ukraine can survive or withstand a war for any extended period of time if the Russians find themselves in this key central region of Ukraine itself. Now, all of that is taking place, and of course there's been further reports of further Russian advances around Pakrovsk. I suspect that all of these battles now are connected with each other. I think that the Russians, before long, are going to carry out a major breakthrough in the Dnipro region towards the river, and I suspect that after Pakrovsk falls, that process is going to greatly accelerate. And I read yesterday another analysis of the war from another Russian military scholar, who again repeated that the landscape in Dnipropetrovsk region, basically open fields, small villages, few forests, no streams, no dense network of small towns and industrial facilities. That kind of landscape works against the defense and makes it easier for the Russians to advance, and advance much more quickly than they have been doing up to now in Donbass. So I think this is true. And I think, as I said, within the next few months, and I, by the way, agree with Owen Matthews, I think that the Russian offensive, as Russian offensives generally do, is gradually building up momentum. It began slowly in April. It's gradually been intensifying and getting stronger week by week and month by month. As I said, that Russian offensive will probably reach its peak point sometime in mid to late summer, when all of the various crises, what Owen Matthews admitted was a nightmare game of whack-a-mole, with the Ukrainians shuffling close forces from one part of a 1,200 kilometer front line to another, when Ukraine's problems will compound, and as Kirill Budanov warned some months ago, that they will become almost insurmountable. Anyway, there it is. That's my own personal view. I think that it's time that a major reassessment be carried out, especially within the United States, by the US intelligence community, of the information they have been getting about the state of the war, about the realities of the war. I suspect that they have been leaning far too heavily on the Ukrainians for the information that they have, and that if they reassess that information, they will come to a completely different picture, and one which might shock them. Anyway, this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. And let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can also support our work by going to Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day.